For the past 2 years now, I have been 100% on LUMIX, but one little secret you may not know, even though my channel is mainly about LUMIX cameras since I started it, even after buying my first LUMIX camera, I was a big Sony fanboy. My first mirrorless camera I bought right before I graduated from university was the Sony A7S. Later, I bought the Sony A7S II and then landed on the Sony A7 III with that insanely good autofocus at the time. I never could have imagined switching to another system. Like, I loved my Sony cameras until I bought and started using my first LUMIX camera. So in this video, I'm going to reveal the true reason I left Sony for LUMIX and why I continue to use LUMIX. This video could hit hard with some of you Sony users and their recent release of the Sony A1 Mark II. And it'll also provide some insight and reasons why I choose LUMIX over other brands in general. My name's Dustin, your video tour guide, and remember to keep your arms and legs inside your chairs at all times. Sit back, relax, and enjoy the video. Before I get into the reasons why I sold all my Sony cameras, I need to explain what led up to me buying my first LUMIX camera because I had zero biases at the time. These days, you can definitely label me as biased because now, if you can't tell, I have a working relationship with LUMIX. They've invited me to exclusive events, and I've done a few sponsored pieces of content with them. However, they do not sponsor me. I'm not an ambassador. They don't pay me to say what I say. I just like their cameras. Now, back to when I bought my first LUMIX camera as well, I wasn't making YouTube videos. I had no contact with LUMIX essentially. The decisions that led me to buying a LUMIX were completely unbiased. Now these days, I still try to be unbiased, honest, and critical of any piece of gear I talk about on this channel. Now, I mentioned I owned 3 different Sony cameras, and I was very much excited for the successor of the A7S II, the A7S III, because some of my frustrations with my A7 III is that it would overheat, especially when I shot in 4K. And so at the time, my big thing was I wanted a camera that wouldn't overheat when I shot in 4K. At the time, there wasn't really many options except for the GH cameras. Now, I had heard of LUMIX/Panasonic, but in my brain, this is what I saw when I heard the brand Panasonic, and there just wasn't a cool factor to them. I know it's not a reason really to buy a camera, is for the cool factor, but at the time I'm in my early 20s, so that mattered to me. And I just want to emphasize how much I loved my Sony cameras. There's tons of pictures of me using my Sony next to Red cameras because that's what I liked using. Red was cool at the time, but they were too heavy and annoying to deal with, so I avoided them as much as I could unless I had to use them. And then the first time I actually used a LUMIX camera was the GH5S Mark II because one of my wedding clients wanted to future-proof his wedding video by having me shoot it in 4K. So he was actually the one that suggested I use the GH5S Mark II. I was confident that I could use any camera, so I rented it and used it. Now, to be honest, I didn't like it. I definitely preferred my Sony at the time, but it made me more aware of LUMIX. So when LUMIX announced they were making a full-frame camera, I paid a bit more attention. Months later, I actually ended up renting that camera, the LUMIX S1, because I knew it could do 4K 60 at Super 35 and apparently wouldn't overheat. This was crucial because I was shooting a bike race in the dead of summer heat in Utah, which pushes over 100 degrees sometimes. So I saw it as a perfect opportunity to give it a go and also shoot a wedding with it. This is where LUMIX really interested me because yes, the autofocus wasn't as good as my Sony, but the image quality was amazing. It kind of caught me off guard because of how biased I was towards my Sonys. A few months later, I was really hoping that there would be some kind of announcement about the Sony A7S III, and there wasn't. So this is where I decided I was going to buy one of those new full-frame LUMIX cameras because I was tired of waiting. Now, months later, I watched this short film that was shot on the LUMIX S1H, and that is what convinced me to buy my first LUMIX camera. At the time, I did have a full-time job in global marketing doing video, but I still did some freelance weddings, promo videos, and commercial stuff on the side. So I had shot a couple weddings with the S1H after I purchased it, and I noticed that those videos that I would post would get a couple hundred views, and people would ask me questions about the camera. This is where it clicked that maybe I should make YouTube videos on this camera because there seems to be a lack of content, and here's where my YouTube career started. This was back in 2019, 2020 roughly. Not only though did I see it as an opportunity to start a YouTube channel, but also an opportunity for me to learn everything that this camera, the S1H, had to offer. This is when I really started to enjoy using LUMIX because I discovered everything this camera could do and my Sony's couldn't, and the list was pretty extensive. I even started to feel kind of a cool factor using my LUMIX S1H on shoots because people would say, LUMIX? I've never heard of that camera. And I would say, oh, well, it's Netflix approved. People would take it more seriously. Not that that really matters at all, but hey, it made me feel the cool factor to using LUMIX. So anyways, I continued making YouTube videos about the S1H. And about a year later, Sony finally announced the A7S III. And I immediately pre-ordered it. Like, it was everything I could have dreamed of in a Sony camera. Later, I was even making some content on the A7S III, and later even the FX3, and those are some of my best performing videos. I didn't own the FX3, but I used them at work all the time. However, over the years, I started selling off my Sony cameras. The A7S, my A7S II, and even my A7 III. But still held on to my S1H because of how much more it still offered over that A7S III. I also noticed on shoots as well, I would lean towards using my S1H still over my A7S III. There was just something special about the image, the functions, the reliability, and just more. Now in this time, LUMIX did reach out to me just to introduce themselves and be in contact with me. And they eventually ended up letting me use the GH6 before release, but I ended up sending the camera back a couple weeks after release. They also released the S5, which I eventually purchased as well, and I just was kind of starting to lean more towards LUMIX, even though the autofocus was terrible in comparison to my Sony. Then it was the announcement of the S5 II and having good autofocus that let me finally decide to go all in on LUMIX. And this is the part where a lot of you are probably here for, and that is, why exactly do I stay on LUMIX then? There's essentially three big reasons that I've alluded to. The first one is how feature-rich LUMIX cameras are. I've seen some videos and people say right now that LUMIX is falling behind, but honestly, I don't think that at all. The S1H and S5 II still hold up to this day from a feature and specs camera when you compare to a lot of different cameras. The IBIS modes, it can shoot 6K, it can do ProRes internally, B-RAW over HDMI, ProRes RAW does all I. Sure, it doesn't have full frame, 4K 60 or 4K 120, but a lot of cameras also don't have shutter angle, synchro scan, open gate, luminance spot meter, anamorphic IBIS, or D-squeeze. I could keep going, but you get the point. And I've made videos too, touching on all of these features as well. Other brands are just barely starting to catch up and surpass in some aspects, but LUMIX is definitely not falling behind. The second reason is firmware updates. LUMIX is still king, in my opinion, when it comes to firmware updates. As an example, the S5 II and S5 IIX are almost a new camera now. They added new IBIS modes, more autofocus settings, frame.io integration, proxy recording, the ability to connect to the new LUMIX Lab app, and more. People may not know this too, but you can update your LUMIX camera via the app, either LUMIX Lab or LUMIX Sync, which LUMIX Sync will eventually be going away. But I don't know of any other brand that does that. Also, their firmware updates don't mess up your camera, at least they haven't yet. And to be fair, Sony and other brands as well are trying to compete with this. They added shutter angle, I believe, in their FX3 and some anamorphic D-squeeze options, but they're still catching up in this aspect. And it shows in new releases of a lot of their cameras, like the A1 Mark II, having some features that they could easily add to the A1 via firmware, but they just don't. Or even making promises of adding something that they don't add for years. I honestly don't know of a scenario where LUMIX has actually promised something via firmware and then release it like years later. They honestly don't tell us what they're going to add until it's close to being added. They say, maybe, it could come. If you want something on your LUMIX camera, and as long as there's not a hardware limitation, you can probably bet that they will add it if the majority of the community wants it. We saw this with the S9 and them removing the record limits. I'm actually filming on the S9 right now. And then the last reason, and probably most important reason, is the value of LUMIX cameras. The LUMIX S1H can do almost everything and more besides 4K 60 full frame and 4K 120 frames per second that the A7S III or the FX3 can do for almost half the price. Sure, there are some minor differences, but is it really worth an extra $2,000 for those features? Now, don't get me wrong, there is disadvantages with LUMIX. The HDMI lag is terrible. The rolling shutter sucks. The autofocus probably needs some tweaks, even though 95% of the time, it's amazing for me. The lens lineup is not as strong, I'd say, as Sony's, as in there's more first-party options, but the L-mount Alliance, Sigma, Leica, and now Samyang are considered first-party lenses, so it helps to have those, but it's true, LUMIX needs to work on that. However, people forget too that LUMIX is still a young brand when it comes to full-frame mirrorless cameras. I remember the days when people were saying the same thing about Sony mirrorless cameras, that there wasn't many lens options in E-mount. So eventually, LUMIX will probably catch up, I have no doubt, in lens options. But it is something to keep in mind. And even with the HDMI lag, the GH7, it's much more improved. And so I have hope that future cameras, it'll also be improved. And so, even if Sony offered, or any other brand, everything that my LUMIX had to offer, I would probably still buy the LUMIX because it would probably be way cheaper. To me, it's just common sense. Oh, but the image quality is better on Sony. Personally, image quality for me is subjective these days. All cameras these days look good in the hands of the right person. I'm biased, and I think that LUMIX looks better than Sony, and it's easier to work with, but people can make that argument for Sony, Canon, Blackmagic, Nikon, any brand. The last thing to consider, though, about LUMIX that is also a weak point is that there is currently not really a good upgrade path. There's no flagship. There's not really anything after the S5 II, and so a lot is riding on whatever LUMIX releases next, even for me. If it's a letdown, then I might be in the same position I was years ago when I bought the LUMIX S1H and start experimenting with other brands. But I have hope they're going to have some kind of answer soon. Only time will tell. So if you want to leave Sony for LUMIX, I got affiliate links down in the description. They help support the channel, so if you use those, thank you. I also want to know what your guys' opinions are. Leave them down in the comments. Let's talk about it. But you can also just support me by hitting the subscribe button and the bell button to be notified of future uploads. Till the next video, though, happy filming.